Now, Africa is being blackmailed into feeding Europe. This activity is being carried out by the United States, Turkey, the United Nations, and Europe. To understand what I'm talking about, allow me this for you in the next few minutes with some evidence so you can be able to very well. Now, on the President Erdogan of Turkey went to Sochi to meet President Putin. And the reason why he went to Turkey to meet President Putin was that he wanted to revive the Ukraine grain deal, food deal, which Russia had signed together with Turkey and the United Nations. Now, this deal was meant to bring Ukraine's food to the world. The United Nations, the United States, and Europe used the grain which comes from Ukraine as a weapon to a certain extent. And this is by saying the world, especially the global south. And by the global south, they want to focus on African countries, that the African countries need Ukraine's grain to survive. But as I'm going to show you, the evidence is here for you to decide whether Africa really needs food and grain as it is being mentioned by the United States. We have seen a lot of diplomats from the Western world in Africa and even on international platforms like Nations General Assembly saying that Russia's activities or military operation in Ukraine has affected the food on the international market. Sorry for that. Now, this article which came out on the 4th of September says that the purpose of the deal, as Putin said, was to allow Ukraine's grain to come to the international market. That deal, which was brokered, of course, by President Erdogan, came in. It was supposed, or it was agreed, Putin to allow not only Ukraine's international market, but also Russia's grain to come to the international market. As you know, sanctions have been put onto Russia so that Russia cannot export its grain onto the international market. But President Putin said that the deal that allowed Ukraine to export its grain will not be restored. During this visit of 4th September, he said that the deal would not be restored until the West lifts the embargo on Russia's grain. Now, in this meeting, which came after quit the UN, Turkey brokered agreement that allowed Ukraine to export its grain and other commodities from 3 of its Black Sea ports during the war with Russia. Putin said that the Western claims that Russia had stopped global food crisis by suspending in the grain deal were incorrect because the prices did not rise. And why did the prices not rise? Let us examine. We remember that in one of his calls with President Zelensky, President Museveni mentioned that President Zelensky had said that he would give Uganda grain and told him that we are self-sufficient when it comes to food. When we go to Ethiopia, for example, Ethiopia was able to replace the grain from Ukraine, which is imported, by growing its own wheat. And when we talk about grain, we are talking about like rice, we're talking about majorly wheat, which comes from these countries. Countries like Ethiopia were able to grow their own wheat and replace what was being imported. Majorly, countries in Africa are self-sufficient. Even when we talk about a country which President Putin said that he would give free food, Zimbabwe mentioned even at the Russia-Africa summit that it is self-sufficient, it doesn't need any food from outside. Now, this shows you that this claim that has been used by the West, that Africa needs Ukraine's grain, is a false. Let us now also look at, Ukraine's share on the international market comes to how much grain the country is producing. What of the international grain production? Now, when we look at the international producers of grain on the international market, President Putin said that Ukraine shares only about 5%. And that 5%, it means that it is not very significant. That share is not very significant. So let us look at the biggest of grain on the international market. On the international market, as we are seeing, the biggest producer of grain is number 2 is India. Ukraine is not even anywhere near the top 5 producers of grain. This is information from 2022 to 2023. Grain.com. Now, the number 2 producer, the second biggest producer of grain is India. Number 3 is Russia. We is coming in at number 4. Number 5 is France. We have Canada at number 6 and Germany at 7. Ukraine is not anywhere near. Pakistan is the 8th producer of grain in the international market. Australia is the 9th producer on the international market. And of course, it is unfortunate that many African countries are not among those who are the biggest producers, even though we have a lot of good land on the African continent. Ukraine comes in. Ukraine is way past number 5 at number 10. So if Ukraine's grain is so important, why is it at number 10? So this is another issue that we have, because they are using Africa into this war and into Ukraine. Now, there is another issue that we and mention it clearly for us to be able to understand this issue of grain and how they are using Africa to feed Europe when it comes to the issue of grain. This war is being used to feed Europe and claim that it is Africa which needs grain. Let us look at what President Putin said at this particular meeting when they met with President Erdogan. Now, what did the President Putin? All right.
Because the in world grain exports, as it was 5%, remains so. In current conditions, it will decrease. To put it mildly, the West deceived humanitarian goals of the Black Sea Initiative to assist developing countries. More than 70% of the 32 million tons of cargo exported from Ukraine, I want to emphasize this again. More than 70% went to wealthy countries, primarily to the countries, but
now what he's saying, President Putin is saying, is that 70% of the grain which the West has been claiming that is coming from Ukraine to go to poor countries, developing countries which need it, and going to Europe. This is what has been the case. This is the issue. Erdogan came out to try to dispute what the president is saying. President Erdogan himself said that it is not 70%, but he said that what is going to Europe is 46%. 46%. President Putin said that what is going to Europe is 7%, and what is going to Africa is 3%. It's just 1%. 3% is what they are using to blackmail Africa, as if all the grain that is coming from Ukraine is coming to Africa. Now, Erdogan said that what is going to Europe is 46%, and what is going to Turkey is 14%, and what is going to Africa is 6%. But without shame, President Erdogan also said, and he insisted actually, that he is working to save poor countries. And I can see that in this conversation, when having unashamedly was insisting that the grain is going to the poor countries of the South. Now, President Erdogan said himself that the grain from Ukraine, 14% is going to Turkey, and if you add that up, 60%. And the two, Europe and Turkey, they constituted 60%. And let us be reminded that the two is, the continent of Europe and Turkey, both of them are in NATO. So we consider them Europe. Turkey is also considered Europe. So President Putin is not wrong. Now, what President Erdogan insisted is that 6% is going to, but still you can see that there's a difference between 60% and 60% is a huge. So you cannot use Africa and say the grain is going, when you are the one who's getting 10 times what is coming to Africa. So this is what I wanted to debunk. And this is very important also for us as Africans to understand, as we are pushing out the African narrative and to the false narrative that the West is feeding Africa. In the actual sense, this is feeding itself at the expense of Africa. It is getting the grain from Ukraine to feed itself and is claiming that the grain is coming to Africa. So this video was dedicated to debunking this myth by the West and including, of course, the United Nations, who have been spreading false narratives on the international stage that which is coming from Ukraine is needed majorly in the South and not in Europe. If they have a problem, if Europe has a problem when it comes to hunger, it needs not to be ashamed. It needs to come out that we want to feed ourselves, and the grain in Ukraine is in Europe. It is not Africa which needs it. So with that being said, I want to thank you for keeping with me, and subscribe to the channel, invite others, and share the video if you see it as very important, because this is very important information for us to spread and correct the false narrative that Africa needs aid from anyone. Africa needs help from anyone. Africa doesn't need any help from anyone. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Blessings.